The small town of Willow Creek wasn't kind to dreamers, especially women who had nothing, and Mary was one of them. At just 22, she had already known hunger, loss, and humiliation. Her father's debts had left her family with nothing, but whispers in the marketplace and pitying glances from neighbors. Each day as she walked past the general store, she could hear the hushed voices, the mocking words. There she goes. The mail-order bride? The title stung worse than any insult. It wasn't her dream to marry a stranger in a faraway land, but poverty left her no choice. She had answered one of those newspaper advertisements. Men in the West looking for wives, promising security and food in exchange for loyalty and companionship. For Mary, it wasn't romance. It was survival. The townsfolk didn't understand that, they only saw weakness. They laughed as she carried her worn carpet bag, stitched carefully with her mother's old thread, preparing to board the evening train. To them, she was desperate, a girl selling herself to the highest bidder. But if they had looked closer, they might have seen something else. Beneath her faded blue dress and the second-hand shawl draped across her shoulders, Mary carried herself with quiet dignity. Her hands may have been calloused from work, her shoes scuffed from years of walking dirt roads, but her spirit had not yet broken. As she stood by the edge of the station platform, clutching her small bag, she whispered a silent prayer. Please, God, let this not be the mistake they say it is. And that was the moment he saw her. Jonathan Blackwell was a man who needed no introduction in Willow Creek. A millionaire rancher, owner of sprawling lands that stretched beyond the horizon. He was admired, envied, and feared in equal measure. Some said he had everything, cattle, money, power. But those who truly knew him understood one truth. All his fortune had never given him what he desired most, a family of his own. He had come into town that evening to settle business at the bank. But when his eyes fell upon Mary, something in his chest shifted. He didn't see the mail-order bride people whispered about. He didn't see desperation or shame. He saw courage. He saw the quiet strength of a woman standing tall in the face of cruelty. The laughter of the crowd reached his ears, taunting remarks aimed at the young woman who was leaving to marry a man she'd never met. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He had never cared for the gossip of small minds, but this time it cut deeper because it wasn't about him. It was about her. And without hesitation, the rancher stepped forward. The sound of his boots against the wooden platform silenced the mocking voices. The people turned, whispers shifting into shock, for here stood Jonathan Blackwell himself, a man no one dared to cross. Mary looked up, startled, as his shadow fell across her, and in that steady, commanding voice that had built an empire, he spoke words that would change everything. They call you a mail-order bride, miss. But to me, you are mine, and you won't be leaving this town unless it's by my side. The station grew silent. Mary's heart pounded as the words echoed in her ears. You are mine. She had never spoken to this man before, yet his voice carried the weight of certainty, like a promise carved in stone. The crowd, moments ago mocking her, now stood frozen in disbelief. A hush swept over them, broken only by the whistle of the approaching train. Mary blinked, clutching her carpet bag tighter. Sir, I don't know you, she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. Jonathan Blackwell's piercing blue eyes met hers. They weren't the eyes of a man claiming possession, but of one declaring protection. No, he admitted quietly, you don't. But I know enough. I know you're better than the lies they've spread. I know you deserve more than leaving here in shame. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. An old woman gasped. A group of young men who had jeered at Mary just moments ago shuffled uncomfortably under the rancher's stare. No one dared laugh now. Mary's cheeks burned. People will talk, she managed. They already do, Jonathan said, his voice calm, steady. But I don't care. Let them choke on their words. What matters is what we choose to believe. Mary's chest tightened. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Not her father, not her neighbors, not anyone. Her whole life had been measured in what others thought she lacked. But here stood a man who looked at her as though she was already enough. Still, doubt clawed at her. "I was supposed to leave tonight," she whispered, lowering her gaze, "to meet a man who promised me a roof and bread on the table. I don't know if I can risk staying." Jonathan stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. "And do you think a stranger from hundreds of miles away will give you more respect than I can, standing right here in front of you?" His voice softened. "I am not asking you for an answer tonight. I am asking you to trust me. Give me the chance to prove that you don't need to run to find safety." "Or love." Mary's breath caught at the word. Love. She hadn't allowed herself to dream of such a thing, not when survival had been her only goal. The train screeched to a halt, smoke filling the air. The conductor called out for passengers. Mary stared at the open door, her escape, her future, one that promised food, maybe shelter, but also the unknown. Then she looked at Jonathan, a man rooted in strength, whose presence alone had silenced a whole town. Her fingers trembled as she loosened her grip on the bag. She didn't step onto the train. Gasps rose from the crowd. People leaned in, whispering furiously. "She's staying? With him?" Jonathan noticed her hesitation and gave a reassuring nod. "That's all I needed to know," he said gently. The train pulled away, leaving behind only smoke and curious stares. Mary's chance at being a mail-order bride was gone, but strangely her chest felt lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. Still, the whispers of the town were sharp. Later that evening, as Jonathan escorted her home, two women passing by sneered loudly enough for her to hear. A millionaire. Could have anyone. Why her? Mary's face flushed with shame, but Jonathan paused mid-step, turned his head, and met their gaze with quiet fury. "Because she has something money can't buy," he said firmly, "and if you can't see it, that's your blindness, not hers." The women lowered their heads and scurried away. Mary looked up at him in astonishment. "Why do you defend me so fiercely?" she asked softly. Jonathan's jaw tightened. For the first time there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Because I know what it feels like to be judged by whispers instead of truth. They call me a millionaire rancher as if money defines me, but all it has ever brought me is envy, not respect. Until now." Mary's heart ached at his words. Beneath his wealth and power, he was as human as she was, longing for acceptance, searching for something real. As they reached her small, weather-worn cottage at the edge of town, Mary hesitated at the door. The moonlight caught her face, softening her features. "I don't know if I can believe in fairy tales anymore," she admitted, "but I want to believe in honesty, and you've given me more of that in one evening than I've had in years." Jonathan bowed his head slightly. "Then let's begin there." Mary's lips curved into the faintest smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a burden, not as a desperate girl, but as a woman worthy of choice. And though the night was quiet, deep in her heart, Mary knew her story had just taken a turn no one in Willow Creek could have imagined. The next morning, Willow Creek was buzzing. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Jonathan Blackwell, the richest rancher in the valley, had stopped a young woman from leaving town, calling her his before she ever boarded the train. At the general store, whispers filled the aisles. At the saloon, men laughed behind their mugs of beer. Even in the churchyard, matrons shook their heads. A mail-order bride tied to a millionaire? Preposterous. Mary felt the weight of every glance as she stepped into town. Her simple blue dress and worn shawl made her look even smaller in the eyes of her neighbors. Yet there was something new in her step, not arrogance, but the faintest spark of hope. Jonathan walked beside her, tall and commanding. Wherever he went, conversations halted and eyes followed. He didn't seem bothered by the stares. Instead, he carried himself with quiet pride, as though every whisper against Mary was a battle he was willing to fight. At the bakery, Mrs. Porter, the baker's wife, called out sharply, "Mr. Blackwell! Her man of your standing deserves a lady of refinement. Not—" She paused, her eyes narrowing at Mary. "A girl whose only ambition was to be shipped away." Mary's cheeks burned. She lowered her head, wishing she could vanish. Jonathan, however, stopped in his tracks. He turned to Mrs. Porter, his gaze sharp. "With all due respect, ma'am, refinement is not measured by dresses or family names. It is measured by character. And if you cannot see the strength in this young woman, Perhaps you are the one lacking refinement." Gasps filled the street. Mrs. Porter turned pale and muttered something before scurrying inside. Mary looked at Jonathan in disbelief. "You shouldn't speak for me," she whispered, once they were out of earshot. "It only makes their whispers." Louder. Jonathan's eyes softened. "Then let them whisper. Their words cannot change who you are. Only you can decide that." Mary struggled with her emotions. She was grateful more than she could admit, but she also feared the shadows of judgment. Could she truly build a future here, under the eyes of those who doubted her? That night, she sat by the window of her cottage, staring at the moon. The letter she had received from the man out west, the stranger she was supposed to marry, lay folded on the table. His words had promised her security, but they were hollow, impersonal. He had wanted a wife as one might order furniture, useful, present, silent. Jonathan's words, however, had been filled with conviction. He had looked at her, not through her. Still, Mary's doubts lingered. Wealth was power in a town like Willow Creek, and Jonathan had plenty of it. Was she truly special to him, or just a passing fancy? She couldn't afford to be a fool. The following day, Jonathan invited her to visit his ranch. Reluctantly, she agreed. As they rode out in his carriage, Mary's eyes widened at the sight before her. Miles of green pastures stretched into the horizon. Herds of cattle grazed peacefully, and the Blackwell homestead stood tall against the hills, sturdy, proud, and full of life. Children of ranch hands played near the barns, waving as the carriage passed. Workers paused to tip their hats to Jonathan. There was respect in their eyes, but also warmth. He wasn't just a man of wealth. He was a leader who cared for his people. Mary's breath caught as she stepped down from the carriage. She had never seen such abundance. Yet Jonathan, noticing her awe, simply said, "This land is nothing without heart. Money builds fences, but it doesn't build a home." He led her through the ranch, showing her the stables, the workers, quarters, the wide fields. Everywhere they went, he treated his men with kindness. Mary saw how they looked at him, not with fear, but loyalty. At last, they stopped by a quiet spot overlooking the valley. Jonathan turned to her. "Mary, I don't care what this town calls you. I care about what you see when you look in the mirror. Do you see shame? Or do you see the woman I see? The woman who deserves more than survival?" Tears welled in her eyes. For so long she had only seen herself through the cruel words of others, but standing here, under the wide sky, with this man's unwavering gaze upon her, she felt something stir, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. But as the wind swept across the valley, carrying the sound of cattle bells in the distance, Mary knew one thing with certainty. Hope was fragile. And in a world where envy and cruelty thrived, it would not go unchallenged. For even as Jonathan vowed to protect her, shadows were gathering, shadows that threatened to tear them apart before their story could truly begin. The days that followed were anything but quiet. Mary's decision to stay in Willow Creek instead of leaving on the train had turned her life into the center of every conversation. Wherever she went, whispers followed. Some were cruel, others curious, and a few were even admiring, but all of them weighed heavy on her shoulders. The hardest part wasn't the townsfolk. It was the doubt within her own heart. Sitting by the small window of her cottage, Mary stared at the folded letter from the man out west. His words echoed in her mind, cold, transactional, without an ounce of affection. "You will be expected to cook, clean, and provide company. In exchange, I will provide food and shelter." Her chest tightened. Had she truly been ready to bind herself to such a life? And then there was Jonathan Blackwell, the man who had boldly declared her his, who had silenced the mocking crowd, who looked at her as though she mattered. He was everything the man in the letter was not, but that was the problem. He was too much, too wealthy, too respected, too powerful. Why would a man like him risk everything for a woman like her? That question haunted her. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fiery orange, Jonathan arrived at her cottage. He carried a basket of food, fresh bread and meat from the market. "You shouldn't have to eat scraps just because others choose to be cruel," he said simply, setting it down on her table. Mary looked at him warily. "Why do you keep helping me?" Jonathan's expression softened. Because I see something in you worth protecting, worth cherishing. Her heart fluttered, but fear quickly smothered it. And when the town turns its back on you because of me? What then? Your reputation, your standing. It'll all suffer. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. Mary, I built my life with my own two hands, not with their approval, and I'll be damned if I start caring about their gossip now. But while his confidence reassured her, the rest of Willow Creek wasn't so easily swayed. At the saloon, whispers grew sharper. A group of ranchers muttered into their drinks. One, a bitter man named Samuel Green, slammed his glass onto the counter. That girl is making a fool of him, he sneered. Jonathan Blackwell, tied up with a nobody? Mark my words, she'll bring him nothing but shame. Another man leaned closer, lowering his voice. Or maybe she's after his money. Don't think for a second she isn't. The poisonous words spread like wildfire. Soon, even some of Jonathan's business partners began to question his judgment. At the bank, one man sneered, Careful, Blackwell. Marry a woman with no name and you'll stain your own. Jonathan's temper, usually calm, flared. Better to marry a woman with no name than live among men with no honor, he snapped, leaving the office without looking back. But it wasn't just the men. One afternoon, Mary was walking through the marketplace when a group of women cornered her. Their words cut deep. You think you can rise above your place just because a rich man noticed you? One hissed. Be careful, dear, another said with mock sweetness. Men like him get bored quickly. Then where will you be? Mary tried to stand tall, but her hands shook. She hurried home, tears burning in her eyes. That night she sat across from Jonathan at his ranch house. The grand dining room felt too large, too polished, too far from the world she knew. Finally, she broke the silence. I can't do this, she whispered. Jonathan's fork froze midway. Can't do what? Be this. Her voice trembled. Your world, your wealth, your name. I don't belong here. I never will. They're right. I'll only bring you shame. Jonathan sat, his fork down, his jaw tight. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he leaned forward, his voice steady but fierce. Mary, listen to me. They call you a mail-order bride because they need something to tear down. They need someone to look down on so they can feel higher. But I don't see what they see. I see a woman braver than all of them. Do you think it's easy to walk through this town with your head high while they spit their venom? That takes courage. That takes strength. Tears slipped down Mary's cheeks. But what if I'm not enough? She whispered. Jonathan's eyes softened. He reached across the table, taking her trembling hand in his. You are already enough, Mary. You don't need to prove yourself to them, or to me. You only need to believe it. For a long moment, the silence hung heavy, broken only by the crackling fire. And then something shifted. Mary realized Jonathan wasn't fighting for her reputation. He was fighting for her, but as the warmth of his words settled into her heart, a shadow loomed outside the ranch house. A pair of eyes watched from the darkness, and whoever they belonged to, they were not there in kindness. The night had grown cold. The ranch quiet except for the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, but outside in the shadows danger was brewing. Samuel Green, the bitter rancher who had mocked Mary at the saloon, stood with two men by the fence line. Their faces were hard, their voices low. She's ruining him, Samuel spat. Jonathan. Blackwell was respected, feared even. Now look at him, parading around with some mail-order girl, making us all a laughingstock. If he can throw away his name for her, then maybe he doesn't deserve the land he sits on. The men muttered in agreement. One struck a match, the small flame casting a sinister glow. A little fire in the barns would remind him who he's dealing with. Samuel smirked. Exactly. Let's see how loyal he stays to his little bride, when his empire's in ashes. But what Samuel didn't know was that Jonathan had seen the glint of movement from his study window. He pushed back his chair, his instincts sharp. Mary, stay inside, he ordered firmly, his voice low but urgent, her brows knitted in confusion. What's wrong? Trouble, he said simply, striding toward the door. Mary's heart raced. As she followed him to the porch, in the distance she saw the flicker of a match, the shadows of men by the barns. Her stomach dropped. Jonathan moved quickly, grabbing his rifle from the wall. But before he could take another step, the men lit a torch and hurled it toward the haystack piled near the barn doors. Flames leapt up instantly, licking the night sky. "Fire!" Jonathan roared, racing forward. The ranch hands came running, shouting, hauling buckets of water. Horses whinnied in panic, stomping in their stalls. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Mary stood frozen for a moment, terror gripping her. But then something inside her shifted. She couldn't just watch. She grabbed a bucket from the well and joined the men, her dress catching the sparks of ash as she ran toward the blaze. "Mary, stay back!" Jonathan shouted over the roar of the fire. "I won't!" she cried, her voice breaking but determined. "This is my fight too." Side by side, they battled the flames. Mary's arms ached, her lungs burned, but she kept moving, kept throwing water, kept pushing forward. The other men looked at her with surprise. No lady in town had ever worked like this. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward her even as he fought the fire. She was terrified, but she was brave. And in that moment, he knew she was stronger than any of them gave her credit for. At last, after what felt like hours, the flames began to die. Smoke hung heavy in the night air, and the barns stood blackened but still standing. Exhausted, the ranch hands dropped their buckets, coughing. Jonathan turned, searching the shadows. Samuel and his men were gone, vanished into the night. But their message was clear. This was only the beginning. Mary sank onto the ground, her face streaked with soot, her hair clinging to her damp skin. Jonathan knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears welling. "No, but I thought we'd lose everything." His voice softened, but there was fire in his eyes. "They thought they could scare us. They thought they could scare me. But they were wrong. I won't let them win, and I won't let them take you from me." Mary's breath caught at the intensity in his voice. He wasn't just talking about land or barns. He was talking about her. In the silence that followed, Jonathan brushed a strand of ash-streaked hair from her face. "You see now," he whispered. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours. And as long as you stand beside me, there isn't a force in this town or in this world that can break us." Mary's chest swelled with emotion. For the first time, she wasn't just the poor girl the town mocked. She wasn't just the mail-order bride who almost left. She was part of something greater. But even as she clung to that hope, she knew Samuel and his men would not stop. The fire was only their opening move, and the war for Jonathan's name and her place at his side was just beginning. The days after the fire were heavy with tension. The barns still stood, but the smell of smoke clung to the ranch like a scar. Mary awoke each morning to the sight of charred wood and blackened earth, a reminder of how quickly life could turn to ash. Jonathan doubled the ranch's security. Extra hands were hired, fences reinforced, and rifles kept closer than ever. But even with those precautions, Mary could see the storm still brewing in his eyes. He was restless, consumed with anger at the men who dared to attack his land. One evening, Mary found him in the stables, brushing down his horse with slow, rigid strokes. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense. "You haven't slept," she said, softly, stepping into the lamplight. Jonathan didn't look at her at first. "I can't rest, not while they think they can break me." His hand stilled on the horse's mane. "Not while they think they can scare you." Mary moved closer, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Jonathan, they want you angry. They want you reckless. That's how men like Samuel win. They don't just burn barns, they burn peace, they burn trust." For the first time in days, his eyes met hers. There was a rawness there, a vulnerability he rarely showed. "And what do you want me to do? Sit back and wait until they come again?" She shook her head. "No, but I want you to remember who you are. The man who stood up for me in the marketplace. The man who believes in honor more than pride. If you lose yourself in anger, Samuel wins without striking another match." Jonathan let out a long breath, as though her words had cut through the smoke inside him. Slowly he nodded. That night, for the first time since the fire, he allowed himself to rest. And Mary sat by his side, watching the flicker of the hearth, realizing something she had not admitted, even to herself. Her heart was no longer afraid. The next morning, Willow Creek buzzed with rumors. News of the fire had spread like wildfire itself. Some whispered that it was an accident. Others claimed they had seen men lurking near the Blackwell ranch. A few even dared to say aloud what many thought in secret. Samuel Green had gone too. Far. At the general store, Mary felt the shift. The same women who once sneered now glanced at her with uncertainty. One even offered a cautious nod. It wasn't acceptance, but it was the beginning of respect. Later that day, Jonathan escorted Mary into town. He held her hand openly, walking with a confidence that silenced many of the whispers. At the sheriff's office, he gave his statement, his voice steady and unyielding. "They tried to take what's mine," he said firmly, "but they'll find I don't bow easy." Mary noticed the way the sheriff regarded her, not with mockery, but with curiosity. Standing at Jonathan's side, covered in soot and courage, she no longer looked like a woman waiting for rescue. She looked like a woman who had chosen her place and had fought for it. That evening, back at the ranch, Jonathan surprised her. Instead of discussing fences or threats, he invited her to ride with him. The sky was painted gold as they rode across the open fields. The land stretched endlessly, the grass bending beneath the wind. Jonathan slowed his horse beside hers, his voice low. "This is what I've worked for, Mary. Not the money, not some power. This land, this peace, and I want to share it with someone who understands what it means to fight for more than themselves." Mary's throat tightened. She thought of the girl she once was, clutching a letter from a man out west ready to sell her future for survival. And then she thought of the woman she was becoming, a woman who could stand beside Jonathan Blackwell, not as his burden but as his equal. "I understand," she whispered. Jonathan reached over, his hand covering hers on the reins. "Good, because I don't want a mail-order bride, I don't want a transaction, I want you." Her heart swelled, tears threatening to spill. For the first time she believed it, believed she was more than the name the town had given her. As the sun dipped low and the fields glowed with fading light, Mary realized something profound. The fire that had nearly destroyed them had also burned away her doubts. She was no longer the girl who almost boarded a train. She was the woman who stayed. The woman Jonathan had called his, long before she even believed she could be. But while their bond grew stronger, the shadows of Samuel's threat still lingered, and the final test of their love and courage was yet to come. The morning sun rose over Willow Creek, gilding the ranch with warm light. But beneath the golden glow, unease lingered. Everyone knew Samuel Green hadn't disappeared. He was waiting, biding his time, and Jonathan Blackwell refused to live under the shadow of fear. Mary could sense it in him. The way his eyes scanned the horizon, the way his jaw tightened at every stray sound. The fire hadn't broken him, but it had awakened something, a vow that this land, this life, this woman beside him would never be taken. It didn't take long for Samuel to strike again. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Mary heard raised voices outside. She rushed to the porch just in time to see Samuel and 3 men ride up, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Their faces were grim, their eyes fixed on Jonathan. "Blackwell," Samuel barked, swinging down from his saddle. "You think you can shame me? You think you can stand against me with that girl at your side?" He sneered at Mary, his words dripping venom. "She'll drag you down, she's nothing." Jonathan stepped forward, calm but unyielding. "Careful, Samuel. You've already crossed one line, don't cross another." But Samuel wasn't there to talk. He yanked a pistol from his belt, leveling it at Jonathan's chest. Gasps echoed from the ranch hands nearby. Mary's blood ran cold. "Jonathan," she cried, rushing toward him. "Stay back, Mary," he ordered, his hand brushing her behind him. His eyes never left Samuel. For a moment the world stood still. The setting sun cast long shadows, the wind carrying the smell of horses and dust. Samuel's finger twitched near the trigger. Then Jonathan spoke, his voice steady as stone. "You think I'm afraid of you, Samuel? You think a man who builds his life on ashes has anything to lose? You're wrong. I've already chosen what matters, and it isn't money or pride, it's her." He gestured to Mary, his gaze unwavering. "You call her a mail-order bride. I call her mine, and there isn't a bullet in this world that can change that. The words struck like thunder. The ranch hands shifted, murmuring, their loyalty to Jonathan burning brighter. Even Samuel's men exchanged uneasy glances. Mary's heart pounded, tears streaming down her cheeks. In that moment, every doubt she had carried, the whispers, the sneers, the fear, melted away. He wasn't ashamed of her. He wasn't protecting her out of pity. He was declaring to the world, in the face of death itself, that she was his choice. Samuel snarled, his pride wounded. He raised the pistol higher, only to hear the sharp click of rifles cocking. Jonathan's men had drawn their guns, their aim steady. "This is over, Samuel," Jonathan said firmly. "You've burned, you've threatened, you've tried to break us, but you've already lost. Because while you waste your life in hate, we've built ours in love, and that's something you can't scorch or steal." For a moment, Samuel looked ready to fire anyway, but his men shifted nervously, lowering their weapons. Alone, outnumbered, Samuel cursed under his breath and shoved his pistol back into its holster. "This isn't finished," he spat, mounting his horse, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. As he rode off with his men, the ranch yard erupted in cheers. Mary rushed into Jonathan's arms, trembling with relief. "You could have been killed," she whispered against his chest. He held her tightly, pressing his forehead to hers. "I'd risk everything for you, Mary, because you're worth it, because you were mine long before either of us believed it." The ranch hands clapped Jonathan on the back, some tipping their hats to Mary with newfound respect. The tide in Willow Creek had shifted. She was no longer the stranger with the letter in her hand. She was the woman who stood by Jonathan Blackwell through fire, fear, and fury, and who had been chosen openly, proudly, undeniably. That night, as the stars stretched wide above them, Jonathan and Mary stood at the edge of the ranch, the fields, rolling out endlessly before them. "This land feels different now," Mary said softly. Jonathan smiled, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "Because it's ours. Every acre, every blade of grass, every sunrise, it's not just mine anymore, it's yours too." Mary leaned into him, her heart full. The girl who once thought she needed to leave town to be wanted had discovered something far greater. She had always been enough. And now she was loved, not as a bargain, not as a title, but as herself. As the night settled, Jonathan kissed her forehead and whispered, "No matter what they call you, you'll always be mine." And in the quiet of the Texas night, Mary finally believed it.